last episode, we did an overview of two of the mendicant orders of monks, the Franciscans and Dominicans. Though the Dominicans got their start slightly ahead of the Franciscans, we're going to begin with Francis. It turns out that Francis was not his real name. He was born in 1182 in the central Italian city of Assisi to a wealthy silk merchant named Pietro Bernardone. He was christened with the nickname Giovanni, but Pietro nicknamed his son Francesco. As a son of privilege, Francesco spent his teens pursuing pleasure rather than his studies. When a local war broke out, he did what was expected and joined the army, but it wasn't long before he was taken prisoner. When he was released at the age of 22, with the war still on, he began making preparations to return to the army. But he came down with a serious illness. The diagnosis was not good. It looked like he might die. Faced with his mortality, Francesco did what many do at a time like that. He began to think about eternal things. He rose from his sickbed, disgusted with himself for the pettiness to which his life to that point had been devoted. He then retreated to a nearby hideout, earnest in his desire to seek God. It didn't take long for him to decide that he needed to visit Rome, a place that all believed at that time was the center of spirituality. But the Rome that assaulted Francesco's senses was not the Rome of his imagination. He was deeply moved by the plight of Rome's many poor. They were everywhere. He seemed unable to seek God when surrounded by such misery. What especially bothered him was seeing so many desperate people huddled around the doors of opulent, luxurious churches, doors through which richly clad priests and prelates sauntered. When confronted by a leper, he recoiled in horror. It quickly dawned on him that his reaction was like that of an indifferent church, which tolerated such immense need in their midst, but did nothing to lift the needy out of their conditions. He turned around, kissed the leper's hand, and left in it all the money that he had left. Francesco found in Rome something, very different from what he'd expected. The encounter with God that he'd sought took place, but not at a gilded altar as he had assumed. It took place in the streets of Rome among the needy. It wasn't the clean face of a priest that brought God near to him. It was the grimy face of a poor urchin. When Francesco returned home, he attended the humble chapels of surrounding villages rather than Assisi's main church. There was less pretension in the chapels. The priests who served them were more sincere. His favorite was the simply furnished St. Damian's, served by a single priest at a crude altar. It was there that Francesco became Francis, whose life and legacy would have such a huge impact on so many others. The change that came over the one-time party animal, it was ridiculed by those that had known him. Privileged sons like Francis didn't grovel in the mucky world of commoners, yet that was exactly what Francis now did. He became so attached to the so-called lower classes that his father banished him from the family home. Francis renounced his filial obligation to them in public, saying, quote, "Up to this time, I have called Pietro Bernardone Father, but now I desire to serve God and to say nothing else than Our Father which art in heaven," unquote. From then on, Francis was wholly devoted to a religious life. He dressed in beggar's clothes, moved in with a small community of lepers, where he washed their sores, and restored the damaged walls of the chapel of St. Damian's by begging building materials in the squares and streets of the city. He was just 26 years old. Francis then received from the Benedictine abbot at Mount Subasio the gift of a little chapel called St. Maria of the Angels, nicknamed the Little Portion. That became Francis's favorite shrine, and it was there that he had most of his visions, and it was there that, he eventually died. While meditating one day in 1209, Francis heard the words of Jesus to his followers, saying this, quote, "Preach the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, cast out devils, provide neither silver nor gold nor brass in your purses," unquote. So throwing away his staff, purse, and shoes, he made this the rule of his life. He preached repentance and gathered about him several companions. Their rule was simple humility, poverty, and living out the new life that the gospel brings. Now, their mission was to preach by word and deed. Their constant emphasis was to make sure that their lives exemplified the word and the work of God. One saying attributed to Francis was, quote, "Preach at all times, and when necessary, use words," unquote. In 1210, Francis and some companions went to Rome, where they were received by Pope Innocent III. Intrigues inside the Vatican were legion, their complexity just mind-boggling. Innocent was no dunce. He was wary of anything that looked, well, too good to be true, and Francis seemed just that, someone who not only preached poverty, but exemplified it. Surely, Innocent thought, there has to be an ulterior motive with this guy. And so he told Francis, quote, "Go, brother, go to the pigs, to whom you are more fit to be compared than to men, and roll with them, and to them preach the rules that you have so ably set forth," unquote. Now, whatever Innocent assumed Francis's response would be, he had to have been surprised when the report came back to the Pope that Francis had done exactly what he was instructed to do. And not merely as a show of obedience just to ingratiate himself with power. Francis seemed to genuinely like his assignment. When we see him later communing with nature, it suggests that he did not take the assignment from the Pope as just a grievous trial. Indeed, his simplicity and sincere humility probably found the pigs better company than the papal court. Pope Innocent was impressed and blessed the brotherhood, giving sanction to their unorthodox rule. They now had the right to have their hair cut in the distinctive tonsure. That's the badge of the monk. He told them to go and preach repentance. With papal sanction, the brotherhood grew rapidly. They called themselves the Fratres Minores, the minor brothers. Francis insisted on this as their title, as a warning to the members not to aspire to positions of distinction. All Francis allowed in the way of papal favor was recognition of their order. Everything else was declined because he knew the danger courting power inevitably brings. The members were expected to work. In his will, he stated that they were to visit the sick, especially lepers who sat at the bottom of the social order. They preached in ever-expanding circles and went abroad on missionary journeys. Francis was ready to sell the ornaments of the altar rather than refuse any appeal for aid. In fact, he was ashamed when he encountered anyone that was poorer than himself. Francis was so committed to poverty that he made a kind of covenant of marriage to it, saying that poverty was his wife. In 1217, Francis was presented to the new Pope Honorius III. At the advice of the influential Cardinal Ugolino, he memorized his sermon. But when he appeared before the pontiff, he forgot it all and instead just delivered an impromptu message which won over the entire papal court. Francis made evangelistic tours in 1219 through Italy and then all the way to Syria and Egypt, where he tried to convert the Muslim ruler Al-Kamil that we looked at in a previous episode on the Crusades. When Francis returned from this trip, he found the order that he had established greatly changed. The aforementioned Cardinal Ugolino, he had wormed his way into oversight of the order and installed a new rule, bringing more organization and a lot more discipline. It looked less like a brotherhood and more like an order. Francis was heartbroken over these changes. Cardinal Ugolino knew that he was likely to be the next pope, which in fact he was, Gregory IX. He was determined to use the Franciscans to promote and enforce the interests of the Vatican. Early on, he had offered Francis help to negotiate the intricacies of Vatican life and politics, and Francis had accepted. Little did he realize that he was inviting a force that would fundamentally alter everything he stood for. The new rule that Ugolino installed while Francis was away in the East was a half measure, blending Francis's original liberty with Ugolino's strictness. Just 2 years after that, a third rule was adopted in which all that Francis had in his original vision was effectively swept away. Francis was just too simple, too innocent for the shrewd rulers of the church. His lack of guile couldn't compete with men whose entire lives were lived wielding vast levers of political power. Francis, the founder and inspirational heart of the order, was set aside, replaced by a member now of the nobility. Francis favored freedom of movement, being able to go where and when he sensed the Spirit of God leading him. And so he refused papal privileges that Cardinal Ugolino tempted him with. Francis knew that they came with strings attached. When Francis led the order, this freedom of movement marked all of the monks. But Ugolino knew that made them less dependable as a tool of the Pope. And so he moved deftly to sideline Francis. A strict monastic obedience was enforced. Organization ended up replacing devotion. But let's be fair to the cardinal. A creature of the Vatican, he saw the organization of the church and its ministries through a filter that was, hundreds of years old. He likely thought that he was helping the clueless Francis negotiate his way around the complex web of political power in Rome. Ugolino may have thought that he was being a friend to Francis, but his loyalty was always and only to the Pope, whom the cardinal regarded as the undisputed ruler of all and every facet of church life. It didn't seem right to him that a monastic order wasn't directly answerable to and controlled by the Pope. Ugolino did lay the foundation of the new cathedral in Assisi to Francis's honor and had him canonized only 2 years after Francis's death. But the cardinal could not understand Francis's humility. Priests simply could not rise in the church without a healthy dose of ambition. And wasn't rising the point? Didn't every priest want to be a bishop, and then an archbishop, and then a cardinal, and eventually pope? Well, Francis's sole ambition was to love and serve God by loving and serving the lowest of the low, in whose face he saw the image of God. It was two very different ideas of what it means to serve God. Though Ugolino effectively hijacked the order, Francis managed to carry on in the mode that he always had, without giving any evidence that he was in rebellion. Until his will was read after his death. And then he exposed how the order had been hijacked and turned into something he never intended. Through the whole of the document, there runs a note of anguish over the lost simplicity that had been the power of their first years, when the presence of God had been so obvious, and they had a power to live the holy lives that they had been longing for. It was now plain for all to see that Francis's heart had been broken by the changes made to the order. Never strong, his last years were full of sickness. As his body failed, he jokingly referred to it as Brother Ass. Francis's reputation as a saint preceded his death. We've talked about relics in previous episodes, but relics were always attributed to people who'd been dead for at least several decades, and more commonly, hundreds of years. Francis was a living saint from whom people craved things like fragments of his clothing, hairs from his head, even the paring of his nails. 2 years before his death, Francis composed the hymn known as the Canticle of the Sun, called by some the most perfect expression of religious feeling. It was written at a time when he was beset by temptations with blindness setting in. The hymn is a pious peal of passionate praise for nature. He speaks of the sun and the moon, the wind, water, and fire as brothers and sisters, all called to play their part to the glory and praise of God. In the last week of his life, Francis asked for Psalm 142 to be read to him, since his eyes were now failing. One witness at his bedside said that when his time came, he met death singing. The career of Francis of Assisi, as told by his contemporaries and as his spirit is revealed in his last testament, it leaves the impression of purity, purpose, and humility, of genuine, if I may say it, saintliness. He sought not positions of honor nor a place with the great. With a simple mind, he sought to serve his fellow man by announcing the gospel and living out his understanding of it in his own example. He sought to give the gospel to the common people, and they heard him gladly. He didn't possess a great intellect, but man, he had a great soul. Francis wasn't a theologian in the classic sense, someone who thought lofty thoughts. He was a practical theologian in that he lived the truths the best theology holds. He spoke and acted as one who was fully confident in his mission. The mendicant orders of the Franciscans and Dominicans, which we're going to take a look at next time, they comprised a medieval poverty movement that was in large part a reaction to the politicizing of the faith. It was a movement of priests, monks, and eventually commoners who'd come to believe that church policies sought to wrangle political influence for ever more power in worldly affairs. These would-be reformers wondered, is this what Jesus and the apostles intended? Didn't Jesus say that his kingdom was not of this world? Why then are bishops, cardinals, and popes working so hard at controlling the political realm? The call to voluntary poverty drew its strength from widespread resentment of a corrupt clergy. Not that all or even maybe most priests were, but it seemed that the only priests selected for advancement were those who played the church's political game. The back to the New Testament poverty movement of the mendicants became a political movement in itself, a reform movement fueled by the spiritual hunger of the common people. As early as the 10th century, reformers had called for a return to the simplicity of the early church. The life and example of the apostles was regarded as the norm, and when modern bishops were held up to that example, it was clear that something unusual had happened. Bishops in their religious finery stood markedly higher than the apostles in terms of worldly power and wealth. To illustrate this, I want to ask you if you have the opportunity to visit the cathedral at Cologne, Germany. There's a little museum there called the Treasury. It's towards the back. You'll have to look for it. It contains several display cases with the various vestments and tools the cardinals of Cologne have worn and used. Composed of gold and silver threads, encrusted with gems, these robes are literally priceless. One set of display cases sums up for me better than anything else the utter contradiction of an exalted clergy. It's display cases holding what are called croziers. Now, a crozier is a stylized shepherd's staff. It's carried by a bishop or a cardinal. It's supposed to be a symbol of his role as a pastor, a shepherd. And as a shepherd's staff, it ought to be a functional and useful tool, a humble piece of wood used to guide and protect sheep. But the croziers in the treasury at Cologne Cathedral are made of solid gold. Their headpieces jammed with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, pearls. You would no more use that to tend sheep than you would a painting by Rembrandt. Every time a cardinal wrapped his fingers around his crozier, he ought to have been convicted about how far from his calling as a humble shepherd he was supposed to be to the flock that he was serving. Now imagine you're a commoner at a church one Sunday. You've just been told by the priest that God wants every bit of money that you can give. In fact, God needs your money. Then in walks the cardinal with his jewel-encrusted cape, his mitre, and that priceless crozier in his hand. How long before you begin to say to yourself, what is going on here? Did Jesus wear a getup like that? Did Peter or John, any of the apostles? I don't think so. In fact, didn't Jesus say something about not even having anywhere to lay his head? I'll bet that cardinal has a nice satin-covered down pillow. In earlier centuries of the church, calls for reform were dealt with by channeling them into internal reform movements that directed attention away from the upper hierarchy to a more personal desire for reform that ended up in increased devotion. That's what many of the monastic orders were. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, things began to change. Many of the lesser clergy began to speak out against the abuses of the church. When they did speak out, they often entered the ranks of what were called heretics. Francis adopted a radical devotion to poverty as a way to confront the blatant greed of the church. His example spread like wildfire precisely because it was so obvious to everyone how far off the church had gotten. And it explains why Ugolino felt obligated to bring the order back in line by bringing it under papal control. While outwardly commending their order's devotion to poverty, he installed policies that made the order dependent on their land holdings and property. You know, it's hard to criticize the wealth of the church when you're part of that church and possess a good measure of that wealth. Now, some were wise to Ugolino's ways and managed to stay true to Francis's original vision and commitment to poverty. Because they refused to knuckle under to the cardinal's rules, they were often declared heretics. And as such, they were treated with a brutality that no one can reconcile with the gospel of grace. But that's for a later episode.